So the first thing that I want to show you guys is how the photo that you're using, if you just switch it into black and white, it's not necessarily on its own going to be enough to make for a strong reference photo. So here is, let's minimize this, you don't need that yet. Here is the photo that I'm using. Actually, it's already been cropped down to the size paper that I'm going to use. The photo itself is striking, like wow, that looks amazing. The color, the composition, and that's what you really want to look for when you're looking for something that's going to be in black and white. You want that contrast, something that's going to have high contrast, that's going to stand out a lot to you. Because when you make something into black and white and you don't have the color to separate one area from the other, that contrast is very, very, very necessary. So that's what I'm looking for. And this is a really good one. I got it over at Pixabay. I'll actually attach this reference photo to this post, so if you want to paint from it or draw from it, you can. But in color, that is bold, that is striking, but watch what happens when I just make it black and white. It's not that, not that impressive. Look at the difference there. The color, when it's in color, it is so bold, and it's not just because of the color. The color is giving you that look of higher contrast, but when you make it into black and white, not enough. So what I want to do here, this is still a great photo to work from black and white, but I'm going to make a couple of alterations just to make that stand out a bit more. And one of the easiest ways I do in Photoshop, I just adjust my curves. Let's get this out of the way. You are a bit too, I can't shrink that. Okay, let's move this over. We'll move him up here a little so we can better see. Okay, I'm gonna pull down one area, and you can do this with any photo editor app. You can do it on your phone, import the photo you're going to use on your phone. Any photo editor, you can mess with your curves, you can mess with the contrast, mess with different things. But here I'm just going to mess with the curves. I'm gonna pull my darks down a bit. I'm gonna push my brights up a bit. Now that is striking. Look at the difference. Pretty, but fairly boring. That will draw the viewer in. That high contrast is really going to make a very big difference in drawing your viewers in. And you don't have to copy this exactly once you start on your artwork, but it gives you a better idea of what values you might want. I mean, that difference, look at that. Which one are you drawn to? You're going to be drawn to the higher contrast, much more so than the more muted. So a lot of times it's a good idea to take that photo, and especially if you're making it black and white. Now, let's say you are working from a color photo and you're working in graphite or a black and white painting. I always recommend switch it to black and white anyway, because it's going to make it easier for you to judge your values. Don't work from a color photo and try to, in your head, make it black and white on your project. It's not going to come out as good as it would if you went ahead and used some sort of photo editor to make that reference photo black and white. But then mess with it on top of that, because having a higher contrast, and even on mine, whoops, you don't need that. Even on mine, I ended up hyping up the contrast even more. Once I put my reference photo away, I realized I really like the look of some things being more bold than even this. But the point is, you can't just take any photo and make it black and white and have it be perfect. You really do want to, here again, look at the difference there. You really do want to do a little bit of editing to see if you can improve on that a bit. So the paper that I'm working on here, this is the Arches watercolor hot press 140-pound watercolor paper. It is a 3.9 by 9.8 inch. So this I actually really did enjoy working on. I have to say, you leave it in the watercolor block, and so the paper's not warping. It's holding its shape. It's drying back in shape, just the way that this is put together. So that was surprisingly enjoyable. I've always avoided the watercolor blocks, thinking that would be annoying, but I actually really liked working on it. So the other thing with this, I drew everything out with my water-soluble graphite pencil. That way, as I blended, I'm not going to have any harsh pencil lines anywhere. So areas where I normally, let's say I was working in regular graphite, I would be hesitant to outline a white flower petal with a graphite line, because that graphite line along that white edge, let's say it's should be more subtle, it's going to show up. Here, once I add water, it blends out those lines. So I stuck with water-soluble graphite throughout all of this. These are the Faber-Castell ones, and they are so nice to work with. So I drew everything out first, and then I decided, you know what, I think I want to get a bit of a bokeh background. So I'm adding in some circles, and I wasn't sure how well this would work with graphite, or the water-soluble graphite, just because the way that you blend them with water, it's a little bit hard to control, but I really was happy with the end result. Now with the water-soluble graphite, this is going to give you the ability, you can get something that's super clean, the edges are really tight, closer to graphite, not as clean or easy to control as regular graphite, or you can get a looser, more watercolor feel. Here, I'd say I went somewhere in between the two, but you have, they're a very, grammar is an issue for me right now. It's a really versatile medium to work in. So what I'm doing, I'm starting by using, I want to say this is the HB pencil, and these range from HB up to 8B. So I'm starting with my lightest pencil. HB is going to be the lightest, and I'm going to fill in the dark backgrounds, and I can layer on top of layer on top of layer. You're not going to hit a point like with regular graphite, depending on how you're using it, if you're damaging the tooth of the paper, if you're pushing too hard, well, you don't want to push too hard anyway, but you can get to a point where you're really, the graphite is so slick, it's not taking a whole lot or many additional layers on top of that. Kind of like what colored pencil can do if you've got too much wax or you've pushed too hard and damaged the tooth of the paper. When you're working with this, as long as you stay with a light hand, you don't hit a point where you can't add more layers. As soon as you start pushing very hard with a pencil, that all changes. But you can see here, I'm not pushing very hard. The other really nice thing, I don't have to work in nice, super smooth little circles, keeping everything so that it blends evenly like I would with regular graphite. Once I add water on top of this, it all gets completely smoothed out, and it smooths out really nicely. Better than like ink tints. Ink tints has a tendency, if you apply the pencil directly to the paper, you end up with a bit of a gritty look where it doesn't really dissolve evenly. That is not the case with water-soluble graphite. This does dissolve completely evenly. Very, very smooth finish. Now this watercolor paper, it is not the extra white like you see with the Fabriano Artistico. So it's a little bit more, off-white's not really right either, but it's not that cool bright white. This one is a bit warmer, and it really gave this piece more of kind of an antique photo look, this old black and white photo. It's not super, super bright white. I have to say, I really liked that for this one. There are times where I think I would want bright, bright white, but on this piece, I was so happy with how it came out. I'm really loving this paper. I need to save a bit because it's expensive, but I want to get some of the bigger watercolor blocks too with the hot press. I'm not sure how much I'm going to like it with watercolor. I'm going to try it with ink tints. This may be the paper I switch to for ink tints because I don't like the new Fabriano Artistico, how it warped so badly. I'm thinking with a watercolor block, it may be a perfect solution for that, or with watercolor pencils. And I'm going to be reviewing this and the hot press version of this to see which I like better with watercolor pencils and ink tints, or in this case, the graphite pencils. I'm also going to be testing it for colored pencil to see how well this holds up with that. But so far, I'm absolutely in love with how this paper worked. I'm just going to speed this up a bit. It's the same thing, just working in little circles and ovals, not worrying about which direction the pencil is going in too much, knowing that that all blends out smoothly. And I do want to make sure I pull this color all the way up to the edge of the flowers. I don't want a halo effect around the flowers. If I do that, if my edges are fuzzy between the flower petals and the background, then I'm losing that high contrast, that crispness that I want here. So I do want to make sure I go right up against that. I would rather go a little bit on top of the flower than not quite touch it. And there are a few areas on here where I completely filled in the wrong area, put the dark where it should have been light, or the other way around. It's not a big deal. I just made it work for the piece. It wasn't the end of the world. Now this pencil, you can erase to an extent. It doesn't erase as well as regular graphite, but you can erase it while it's dry. Once you add water, it erases a little, and you'll see that later on. I used my Tombow mono eraser. It lifts some, it lightens it a bit, not a ton, but enough that it's still a good idea to have an eraser handy. But don't plan on using your eraser to come up with highlights later on like you would with regular graphite, or you could with regular graphite anyway. It doesn't lift that much. Even with an electric eraser, it's just not going to lift that much. So do be aware of that. Be very careful, just cautious of where stuff goes. Now, in this case, let's say I had an area where I filled in too dark, and there are a lot of them where I filled in too dark. Well, here's one. There I am erasing. I'm just using a regular eraser there. But let's say I had an area that went way too dark. I'm not going to start over. I'm just going to make it work with my piece. Maybe I lost the flower petal. No big deal. It's not the end of the world. So if it happens to you, don't feel like, oh, I need to throw this paper away. I ruined it. Don't do that. Try and no matter what you're painting or drawing, try as much as possible to make your mistakes, to work them into the piece. Just because things don't come out exactly how you initially planned doesn't mean you can't work with it and make it amazing in the end. But in a case like this where it's not that forgiving, and then you can't really come back and add a lot of white highlights later on. Let's say I wanted to use a white gel pen. That is possible. Make sure you get one that's archival if you're going to do that. But if you're going to use a white gel pen, I would want to make sure that I use that all over the whole piece, not just in one area, because the white gel pen probably not going to be the exact same white as the paper. You can see the white of the paper here. Plus I have graphite on all the paper. No point on this is the white left completely white. There's always at least a little bit of a tint. But let's say that I wanted to come back through with white highlights. Anywhere that I do that, it's very, very obvious that it's a different medium on top of that. It's not going to look like the paper showing through. You're going to get a different look. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad. That just means you're going to want to add that in several places. So let's say one of the petals, I realized I missed a highlight and I really want it. I'm not just going to put a highlight with a gel pen or ink tints or whatever you decide to try. I'm not just going to put that in one location because it'll be really obvious, like a big arrow pointing through to that area. But if you decide to go with a gel pen or whatever else, spread it around, add it all over the place in different areas. Use that for your highlights in several locations, and now it looks intentional, not like you had a big oops. And with the water-soluble graphite, this dries very, very matte. It's not going to have the gloss that you tend to run into with regular graphite. Or shine might be a better word than gloss there. And that's one of the things that I like. When you get things to where they're almost pitch black, I mean, they are dark, dark. It's not straight black, but it is pretty dark. When you get things that dark with this pencil, if you were to do the same and get it that dark with regular graphite, usually it ends up having a bit of a sheen to it. This doesn't. Once you go over it with water, it gets rid of that. So here I'm using a Taklon bristled. This one is a round brush by Simply Simmons, and I've got some water on there. And what you can't really see is I've got a paper towel, just a regular like Bounty paper towel, right under this shelf on my easel. So before I hit the paper, I'm always going to dab a bit of that water off so I don't get out of control. And I want to blend my light areas first. So see how I work on the circles and then blend out? That's going to give me a little bit more control so that I don't end up with things or pull the darker graphite into those round circles. You can see this is way lighter than what I'm going to want in the end, but it's safer. Start light and work your way to the darks. If you start too dark and you realize, oh, that is completely in the wrong area, you really can't fix that easily, or at all. So I do recommend with these, start light and work your way up to the darker colors or values. The first layers will have more of a watercolor type look where you're really going to see the brush strokes. As I work my way through and get darker and darker, I'm going to lose a lot of that. This is the HB pencil, so this is your lightest that comes in that set. I'm working around those circles first, again, just because I don't want to smudge too much into them. And see how even as I get up into the flower petals, look at how I pull that brush right up against my subject. I don't want that outer glow. Don't want to ring around everything. And this brush is not soaking wet. If you have too much water, the graphite just spreads everywhere, very much like watercolor or ink tints would. So you've got to play around with getting a balance of how much water you really want on this brush. I am working upright. I do think it might be easier for some of the effects that you can get to work flat, but my back doesn't allow for it. So I am upright on this. I'm at about a 90-degree angle. So you can tell I'm not using a lot of water because there are no drips flowing down. If you wanted a softer look, you could put the paper flat and let it flow a little bit. If you used a bit more water, you'd have to be careful, but you might want to use masking fluid or something like that to protect your subject if you're going to use a lot of water to get that look. Now, I have not tried masking fluid on this paper yet, but from reviews I've read, it should be fine. And if you're unfamiliar with masking fluid, it's basically kind of like liquid rubber, and it dries in this film that protects your subject. So you can be messy if you're using watercolor. I've used it on ink tints. You can be really messy and you'll protect the white of the paper underneath. You just peel that off when you're done with your background. I avoid it when possible just because it's kind of a pain to put on and take off. I do prefer not using it whenever I can, but there are times where it is a lifesaver and makes things go much easier if you want to be really messy on your background without worrying about messing up your subject in the foreground. And I've tried watercolor brushes, like actual watercolor brushes, much softer, for both my watercolor pencils, my ink tints pencils, and for the graphite pencils. I don't like them that much. I actually prefer the brushes to be a little bit more firm, something more like what I would use for my acrylics. So that is where the Taklon bristles really work well for me. Realized I missed a spot here that was supposed to be dark, so I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. Now, do let the paper dry completely before you go back on top of it with more graphite. First, it doesn't tend to stick that well, but if you go on top of the graphite or the wet paper with more graphite or with a pencil, you're going to damage the tooth of the paper a bit. So it is definitely better. Let each layer dry. And you can use a hairdryer to speed things along if you want. Speed this section up a bit because it's just repeating the same thing. I'm going to make sure those edges stay nice and clean. That is the biggest concern for me when I'm working on a background like this, is keeping those edges of my subject clean as much as possible. If it were something, let's say I'm working in ink tints, I can come back through and clean up those edges by using the white ink tints block, mix it with water, paint that on my edges, make them nice and crisp, and then put the color back over them. I don't have that ability here unless I want to use another medium in combination with it. So I've got to be very, very careful that I don't go crazy with that. It's so easy to smudge accidentally your background into your subject, so just be careful with that. But if it does happen, basically what I'll do on a few of these where I did get kind of fuzzy on the edge, I made the leaves slightly smaller by pulling the background at the very end. I made the edges a little bit more crisp, and that meant pulling some of the background a tiny, tiny bit into the subject so that I cleaned that edge up. But as much as possible, I want to avoid that. So I've switched to a darker pencil here. Everything is completely dry. You can see me working around this flower petal. This is the one I mentioned earlier that I didn't like. Once I was finished with the piece, I backed away and looked at it, and it's like that's where my attention was being drawn, is to this little side flower. It was throwing off the whole flow of the rest of the piece. And so luckily these were really easy to cover up, and the great thing is when I went on top of it with the darker pencils to cover it up, it actually just looked like I had more depth. I ended up with something that looked like more of a bokeh effect. You can see that on the finish when it's kind of blotchy, which is what I wanted. So it was very, very easy to get rid of later on. Normally I would have caught something like that when I did the Photoshop mock-up, and I did do quite a bit of editing, moving flowers around, deciding if I wanted to change things, and I don't know why I didn't catch that flower petal was just, it was very, just drawing attention to the wrong area. But luckily, going darker is no problem. It's going lighter that's a problem with this medium. One of the things that I like so much about working with flowers or roses, well, I guess that is a flower, any type of flower like that, you don't have to be perfect. If you've got something that is in the completely, I have a leaf that I'm missing some of these petals for my reference photo. I just accidentally covered them, different things like that. No one's going to know the difference. It doesn't weaken the piece at all. Whereas if you're starting off with portraits, if the nose is in the wrong place, the eyes in the wrong place, that does weaken the portrait. So if you're getting started, I strongly recommend start with florals or with something that's a little bit more forgiving. That way you can focus on learning the medium, learning to blend, learning control of that medium instead of fussing over one little thing being off and ruining everything, and now you're having to fuss over that. So I definitely think you'll learn faster by learning your medium with something else before you jump into portraits. I don't find that these pencils need to be nearly as sharp. Oops, I think that's an area I went too dark. They don't need to be nearly as sharp. I'm gonna drawing a petal there, as regular graphite. Because the water will dissolve this into the paper, you don't end up with the gritty, grainy look that you would with pencils, regular graphite pencils that weren't sharp enough. I think that was a petal that was supposed to be way lighter than what I have there, than my HB first layer, but I'm just going to let it work for me. I'm not going to be upset or worry too much about it. I'm just going to continue on. That petal is now in more of a shadow. Not a big deal. It's easy to do something like that and realize, oh my gosh, I totally forgot I missed drawing this one petal out, and get so frustrated that you don't enjoy the rest of the piece because you're so worked up over something like that that you missed. Don't do that, especially on flowers. That's why I said start with flowers, because it doesn't really matter. I mean, I added it back in, but let's say I left it out completely. Wouldn't really matter. Leave an arm out on a portrait, that matters. If you are somebody who typically works in color, but you feel like you struggle with your values, getting your darks dark enough, your lights light enough, do some graphite pieces. Start, or even if not graphite, let's say you're working in colored pencil, do some black and white with colored pencil, black and white with oil, black and white with acrylics. Do black and white for a bit, because you are going to learn so much more about values if you work in black and white than if you jump straight into color. It's harder to judge your values in color than it is in black and white. With black and white, you're dependent on those values. Just like I was talking about at the beginning of the video, that matters so much. You're going to learn a lot more, and then when you go to do your color pieces, getting the values right is going to help you that much more. I know a lot of people get hung up on they need to know the exact color in order to make something look realistic. And I'm always telling you guys, it's not the color. Stop worrying about the color. It's your contrast, your values. That's what matters. If that is something, if that's like a concept that your brain is just like, I can't wrap my head around this, I don't get it, stop with the color for a bit and do some pieces in black and white. And that doesn't mean you have to change your medium. You can do black and white in any single medium you want. But learn to depend on your values to make something look realistic. How light your lights are, how dark your darks are. Now you can see I'm being really sketchy, kind of scribbling right there. It won't matter. Once I blend with water, all of that will be nice and smooth. But working in black and white is something that will strengthen your color skills so much, because you'll have such a better understanding of your values. And I know for some people, I've had many students tell me that they didn't want to do black and white because it seemed boring. You know, that's fine. You don't have to, but it will strengthen your skills when you go back to color. And on something like this, let's say you were working with ink tints or a watercolor, you can throw, well, heck, I could even do that over the graphite. You can use a little bit of a splash of color if you wanted to. If you just wanted to throw a bit of purple, a bit of orange here and there, you can do that. But if you can do mostly black and white, it really is going to help you. So now that I've got that all shaded in, I can go ahead and start adding water again. And this is the same thing. I've got to be careful around those circles. I know that the circles are going to have graphite over them. That I'm okay with, but I want to make sure that I don't go too dark, because this does move around a lot. As you add water, you can smudge one area into the next. So you end up loading, you're almost painting by loading the liquefied graphite onto your brush and smudging it into another area. And I will do that intentionally in other areas where I want it to be really, really light. I'm going to use a lot of water and lift some of the other color background from another flower petal or from the background a bit and smudge that into my subject. Now you can layer on top of layer on top of layer with this. It doesn't really reactivate the previous layers that much. This to me feels somewhere in between, say, ink tints, which is very permanent, and watercolor, which is not, and lifts some. This will lift a tiny bit. You can erase it a tiny bit once water's been added. Not much though. So when you want to keep going darker and darker, you can. And the nice thing with that is it lets you start really, really light. So you're not jumping into your darkest darks and accidentally having something in the wrong area too soon. Like that flower petal that I had to redraw in over on the right. If I had gone really, really dark as my background needs to be there, I would have just left it out completely. I wouldn't have been able to lighten it up enough to make it look right or make it work with this. You can see this is a bit blotchy. You can blend stuff out. I could take a mop brush if I wanted and blend things out so it's more smooth. But for this, I want that sort of mottled background. That works really well for me. Now, once you start blending with water, I do recommend don't stop until you're done blending that section, because you'll end up with you'll be able to see the start and stop points. With the watercolor pencils, you can blend into a start-stop point a lot more than you can with something like this. This is closer to ink tints there, where you can really see where you started and stopped a brush stroke. So you want to keep it wet as much as possible. Here I went a little crazy over the B, so I had to take a Q-tip with a bit of water on it and rub some of that off. That works because it was still wet. If that started to dry, I wouldn't be able to lift any of that very well. Keeping that edge nice and clean. Now, if you are somebody who finds yourself to be fairly impatient and you want to finish things pretty quickly, this may be a really good medium for you. Much like it's not even comparable how much faster this is than regular graphite. Because look how quickly I can get darks really dark. That would take so many more layers with graphite. So this area is still a little bit wet. I'm able to take that wet Q-tip and soften the edges of that circle. This area was starting to dry, and I actually damaged the tooth of the paper just a little bit by over trying to rub that out. You start to get the paper to where it's a little bit fuzzy there. Not terrible, but I don't recommend it either. I've got a bit too much water on that brush, so it's wanting to run and create little hot spots there. If you are used to working in pencils and paintbrushes scare you, it will feel awkward at first. The more you use them, they'll get to where the brush just feels like an extension of your hand and you have no problem getting it to do what you want, but it will always feel awkward at first. Don't be discouraged by that. That is normal. It doesn't mean you're bad with paintbrushes and you'll never be good. We all start there. The more you paint, the more comfortable you're going to get with that. It's the same with the airbrush. They'll tell you the same thing. The airbrush will end up feeling like an extension of your hand. It won't feel awkward to control how much air versus how much paint. And paintbrushes are no different. The more you use them, they will just feel very, very natural in your hand, but at first they won't. That's totally normal and something we all experience when we start. If you want to get rid of the awkwardness, paint more. Speed this up a bit because again, it's just repeating what I previously did. And then we're going to be moving into the section that I worked on the live stream, so you can see that all in real time. I will put a link in the description. Hopefully I remember to. I always say I'm going to, and I think I forget half the time. Remind me if I forgot it. But I did have that portions of this over on the live stream, so we will go through that really quickly here. So you can see I'm taking the hairdryer to that. I can dry it off so I'm ready to go on to the next layer right away. There are a few areas I can see right now where I forgot to blend with water. It doesn't hurt anything. I can go back and blend out when I need to. So I'm just working on the background, building that up, making it darker, getting that contrast to be a lot higher. Now I can always go back and make the contrast even higher after I get the flower petals drawn in. So don't feel like you have to have it 100% done before you move on to the next section. You can work back and forth, whatever you're comfortable with. And that's something that I wouldn't necessarily recommend for most mediums. With acrylics, oils you can to an extent, depending on what part of the background you need to go back and change. But with acrylics, that's a lot harder. With something like this, it's the same as colored pencil. You can work on either. Whatever area you're more interested in at the time, that's the area I would recommend working on. So now we are back after the live stream, and I can come back through and start darkening some of this up. Now, there are going to be a lot of little white dots that I want highlights of on the top section of the centers of these flowers. What I'll do is just use the paintbrush. So here I'm adding in, this is the 8B. I'm going to make this darker in here, create these little, this texture. And then when I use the brush to blend some of this a bit, I can use that same, the pigment or the graphite that I pick up on the brush, I'll just dot into the highlighted areas. It's easier than trying to work the pencil around all of those. Here I'm pushing a little bit harder because I don't want that to necessarily blend out as well as everywhere else. I want to keep some of that shape. Actually redrew in, when I started on this bee, I redrew in part of his leg a bit wrong. And he's not the center of attention here, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on him. I just have the hint of the bee. I like that in the original photo. I had to erase a little bit there, came back in. This is what I'm talking about. If something goes wrong, don't have a meltdown over it. Try to fix it. Learn how to fix mistakes, because no matter how great you get at your medium, you are always going to have times where something doesn't quite go right, or you accidentally get a brush stroke or a pencil stroke showing up somewhere where it wasn't supposed to. You want to make sure that you have the ability to fix that. So instead of just throwing something out and starting over because one thing went wrong, figure out how to fix that one thing. It's a very important thing to know how to do. You have to remember, you're not running around showing everybody your reference photo. I mean, you guys see mine just because I want you to know where to get it if you wanted it. But normally, you're not showing people your reference photos. They're not going to sit there and go, oh, I can see where it's different. It's not the same. You're terrible. That's really not how this works. The only time I would really recommend showing a reference photo would be if you're doing pet portraits or just portraits in general and you want to show people this photo yields these results. Like, this is what I can do from this photo. This is how I can improve on this photo, or anything like that. Then I can see a reason of why you would want to show someone the reference photo. But something like this, no. Why in the world would I need to show people the reference photo so that they could further judge me on it not being perfect? Nothing, it's art. It's not going to be perfect. But that's why what you want to remind yourself of, if something goes wrong, like the bee, I screwed up part of the body, I screwed up some of the leaves, I screwed up some of those. No, I'm not going to show it to anybody. It doesn't really matter. They're not going to see this photo or the original photo. It doesn't necessarily, not being perfect doesn't mean your work is lesser, that it's not as good or not as impressive. I think we tend to be a bit too harsh on ourselves. It's so typical of a lot of artists, especially those of us who work in realism. We tend to be pretty harsh on ourselves when things aren't perfect. You know, sometimes when you get to where you're mostly finished with a piece, put that reference photo away, get rid of it, and just sit and focus on what you could do to make yours better, where you might want to bring out highlights, shadows, anything like that. But don't be too worked up on every little thing being exact. It doesn't need to be. I mean, in that case, just use a photograph. You wouldn't even need to recreate the art. We're obviously going to be making changes on the artwork itself. So this is a much smaller, it's a tackle and bristled filbert, a teeny tiny one, and it is wonderful for these little areas. And this is not a brush that I would use for acrylics because the bristles are so short that you end up with paint building up too close at the end where it's attached to the handle, and the bristles end up fraying. It doesn't hold its shape well. But when you're working with ink tints, watercolor, water-soluble graphite, it rinses completely from the brush, so that brush stays almost brand new always. It doesn't really get super damaged as long as you're not leaving your brushes sitting in the water. Now, here's a big tip. If you are not used to working in water soluble mediums, you might think, okay, I've been working with this paintbrush, I'm going to set it in my container of water or mason jar or whatever you're using for your water. Just leave the paintbrushes sitting in there. That will ruin a brush within minutes. You will permanently fray the tips of the bristles, and the longer you do that or they sit in the water, the worse it's going to get. Never leave your paintbrushes sitting in the water. Rinse them and lay them flat to dry. But it's a habit that we all have. It's like what they taught us as kids in school is you put the paintbrush back in and you let it set in the container of water. Never, never, never do that. You really want to break that habit. And it's hard because most of us did it from the time we were kids. But every time you catch yourself doing that, just remind yourself you just damaged that brush. For me, the cost factor of knowing, oh, I'm going to have to spend more money to replace this because I did something dumb, that worked really well for me to get myself to break the habit. Another small round brush here. I also used a liner brush. I used a Taklon bristled liner for some of this. Now, when you're working on something like this, you want to remember, because we tend to be afraid to go too dark. We're afraid to get that high contrast, but you need to remember, if your darks aren't dark enough, your lights won't look light enough no matter what you do. If you keep all of your darks in mid-range, no, your brights don't seem so bright. By darkening up your dark areas, your bright areas will seem so much brighter. Now, when you're working on something like this, don't look at it as a flower. If you try to look at it as a flower as a whole, it usually doesn't come out quite right. What I want to do here, especially with something that has so much contrast, the way that the light is coming through these petals, I want to look at them as abstract shapes. If that means turn your work upside down while you work, do that. But you have to start convincing your brain when you're doing something where you're trying to get something that looks very realistic to look at it in terms of abstract shapes, not as a whole flower petal. If I do that, and this is a problem that I had, especially when I was younger, I would look at things as a whole. The whole flower, the whole fish, the whole whatever, and things came out looking very flat and over blended. I didn't have high contrast because my brain was trying to take over and not let my eyes do their job of seeing what's actually there. If you turn the work upside down, it tricks your brain into not knowing what in the world is going on, and it's much easier for you to see those abstract shapes. And that may be something that you're very hesitant to try because it does feel very awkward at first, but that's the point. That's how you know it's working. And I'm just looking at these, looking at the shape, looking at the negative space. I'm looking at the shadows, but not as shadows, looking at it as the shape and trying to copy that shape close. Again, on something like this, I don't have to be exact, so I'm not going to spend too much time on a portrait. I would spend way more time being more exact, but these shapes are weird. None of those shapes look like flowers. I mean, what is that? When you look at it, when you're sitting up close to it, when you back away from it, it all comes together. As long as you were copying the shapes that you saw in that photo and not letting your brain try to take over. So here I'm using one of my darker pencils. That's either probably the 6 or the 8B. There. Now, normally when working in graphite, I don't recommend starting with an 8B or your 9B, your darkest pencils anywhere. I usually would say build up from some of your harder pencils or your lighter colors. So maybe a 2H, and build up with that as your base before you put the darker colors on top. That way, because the harder pencils are going to get into all of the nooks and crannies of the paper better, the softer lead tends to catch the top and they don't blend out as smooth. So I usually will do several layers of lighter values first before I build up to my darkest pencils. With the water-soluble graphite, you don't have to do that because once the water hits, it's going to dissolve completely. The reason that I usually will start lighter with the water-soluble graphite, though, is just because I can't easily erase or lighten things up like I can with regular graphite. And always remember, if you are trying a new medium, no matter what that medium is, give yourself permission to make the ugliest painting the world has ever seen. Don't work yourself up too much. Whoop, there was an area I decided I went way too dark on. Actually, there was kind of funny. I thought I was using an HB, wasn't paying attention because my HB and my 8B are about the same length. So I was using an 8B where I meant to have an HB. So I erased some just to lighten it up. But anyway, back to that tip on if you are new to a medium, give yourself permission to make a few ugly pieces. If you're spending too much time worrying about your first few pieces being perfect, you're not really going to get a good enough feel for the medium, and you're not going to learn as fast as you would. Go into it with planning to just make a mess, enjoy the process, and get a feel for it. Find out what happens when you blend this area into another area. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you'll hate it, but you're not going to know that unless you try it. And you're not going to want to try it if you've not previously given yourself permission to make an ugly painting. We always want to do our best, but sometimes being too much of a perfectionist can get in the way of really progressing as an artist. You've got to be willing to make the mistakes so that you can learn from them, learn what you like, learn what you don't like, so that you can progress faster. See, I'm just smudging out the darker areas here. I'm smudging it into the white of the paper where I did not add the graphite. But that tones that down. There's not a single spot on this piece where the white paper was left 100% white. And that's part of where I get this kind of antique-y look. The graphite pencils themselves are fairly warm. And then when I tone down the white of the paper a bit, now, that doesn't mean you don't want to leave your brights bright. It just means in this case, I didn't need anything to be 100% white. White itself is not that common in most things that you're going to do. It's going to be used for maybe the highlight of the eye, but for your brightest highlights, you're not going to want to leave that much bright white. If you're trying to make things look really realistic, you don't want a whole lot of straight white. You want contrast, but not necessarily straight white for all of the highlights. It would be easy to look at this and go, okay, my lighter petals, they're just white. Just leave them white. It won't look realistic that way. Actually, it'll look very flat that way too. Now, a lot of what you're doing as you're really zoomed in, you're looking close to things, they won't necessarily make sense, but if you trust your reference photo, you copy what you see there. When you back away from it, it'll all come together. But there are times where I'm drawing a flower petal or a fin on a fish where I don't really see where this is connected to. I don't really know what it is. I'm just gonna, trust that reference photo, put my lights and my darks where they need to be, and then when you back up, it'll all come together. But sometimes you're just sitting so close that you can't really see anything at all. You can't see the details there or what something is until you back away from it, and then you get the full picture and it makes sense. Now for this next petal, or the next couple of petals, I'm going to throw in some of the darks. I'm mixing my HB, some of it I'll come back through with a 6B, a 4B. Knowing which pencil to grab, it just depends on how dark you want an area to be. 4B is darker than a 2B, 6B is even darker, 8B is the darkest in this set. The higher the number is with a B, the darker the pencil is. The higher the number is with an H when you come to graphite pencils, the lighter the pencil is going to be. Now again, I'm going to cover up a lot of the white of the paper here. But first, I'm just going to block in the dark areas, and then what I'll do when I come through with the paintbrush is let that smudge into the white. Because even if I went through a lot of this with the HB, which is my lightest, it would be darker than what I want. So I'll just smudge some of this with water by thinning out the layers that I already will have down. Once an area with the graphite or the water-soluble graphite is dry, you've already blended with water, I don't find that it really reactivates that well. You're not really able to lift much and then use that to spread color around. So it needs to be something that is either still wet or hasn't been blended out with water yet in order to smudge that. Using a liner brush on some of these small areas, and then I'll actually, no, that one's not the liner. That one is that tiny filbert. I think I started with a liner and switched. See how I'm smudging that now into the light areas. I've got to be careful, like right there, I went a little too dark. So I've cleaned my brush, added some water, and I'm going to lift that a bit. That only works if it's still wet. Once it dries, that is not lifting. So what I'm doing there, I have some graphite that hadn't been blended with water on the center of that flower. I was able to add a little bit of water, and I'm sort of painting that at the same time, but then as I pick up graphite, I come down and smudge that into some of the details and basically paint with it on the petal below it. And see, again, just lifting some of the previous color and just smudging that around. It's not quite white. And it's really obvious here when you compare it against the white of the paper how dark that really is. I darken that value up quite a bit. But when you're up against, when the rest of everything else is filled in, it almost looks like it's straight white, even though clearly here you can see that I did not leave that straight white. And that just comes down to the contrast between your lights and your darks, making sure that your darks get dark enough. Another thing to notice on this guy, some of the edges of these flower petals, the two that are closest to the viewer are facing basically in the middle of the paper almost. Those ones, the edges, see how I left a white border around the edges? That border is way thicker than what I'm going to want it to be. But I need to do that so that I don't accidentally go too thin and lose those white edges, because if I do, I can't get them back. So I am being fairly protective of those to make sure. I would rather leave too much and come back later and thin that out than cover too much and not be able to do anything about it. Just remember to try to keep those edges nice and clean. Unless you're going for a very loose style, then that's different. But what I'm doing here, I want those to be really clean. Very sharp. Again, they're using that graphite that's already on the paper to push into the petal to define that edge. And I'm just going to pick my way around. I'm going to come back through and darken up a lot on those flower petals that I already have done. While I want to get them, or the way that I like to work anyway, it's not how you have to work, but I like to get them done as much as possible and then come back and hype up my contrast later on. I don't want to jump around too much because I start to lose my place. Everything gets very overwhelming if you try to look at the picture as a whole versus let's focus on one little area at a time. There's that HB. I'm going to fill that in. Even though I know that's going to need to be darker, I'm going to start with a lighter value first. Just a lot safer. And around the edges that aren't clean enough, I'll come back through with my 8B pencil and sharpen those up. And then when I blend out with the water and the paintbrush, I will blend away from the subject so that dark just flows into the background. But that will keep the highlighted edge nice and crisp. So that's one thing that I'll do towards the end to clean everything up even more. Realized I was missing this flower's stem. The other stem was going to a little bulb bud thing. Technical term, in case you are wondering. I am an expert. See, it's no problem to make things darker, and they blend in just totally seamless. You can't even tell that I added that in later. It works just fine. The opposite direction, though, not so easy. Again, just looking at those shapes, those abstract shapes. If you don't get your abstract shape perfect, do not kick yourself. It's not that big of a deal. Go for close. On a person, much bigger deal. On a floral, not really. Because if you put a shadow in the wrong place on a person or a pet or an animal, you basically can distort their figure. They will look somewhat deformed because that where those highlights land determines the underlying bone and muscular structure. With the exception, well, to an extent, with the exception of, let's say they're in dappled light, they're under a tree and light is coming through and they've got really interesting shadows all over their face. That now doesn't matter so much. But just regular highlights and shadows you could make them look very deformed if they're in the wrong place. A flower, not really so much. This is why I love playing with flowers or getting people started with flowers, because you're setting yourself up for something that is fairly low pressure in comparison to a lot of other subject matter. If you're drawing buildings, if your lines aren't straight, if things aren't completely vertical or parallel where they need to be, or horizontal, vertical's not the right word there, horizontal or parallel where they need to be, things aren't lining up with each other, then that can really skew the drawing. If you do that with a flower, it doesn't matter. That just means the wind blew a little bit. It really is so forgiving in comparison to so many different subjects. So while you may think that drawing with a fence or the drawing of a house seems simple, it's harder to make that look really good than it is something from nature, like not wildlife, flowers, bushes, trees. Those are much, much more forgiving. And I'm not saying that's all you should ever do. It just, in the beginning, I think makes it much easier to tackle and sets yourself up for more wins, gives you some confidence in learning to blend, learning to use that medium before you jump into some of the more difficult subjects. Now at this point it would be easy to say, okay, I'm finished. I've got graphite on everything. The white of the paper is covered. Everything is sketched in. But look at how much better it would look if I spent another hour on it. That really does make a big difference to continue building. You get to the point where it's pretty much done, and that I think is one of the hardest things a lot of newer artists struggle with, is knowing when something is done. They'll get to this stage and think, okay, done, it's all covered, that means it's finished. Whenever you think something is done, go back and spend another hour, 2 hours on it, and you'll be amazed at the difference. Because here now, what I'm focusing on now that everything's basically filled in, I can see where my shadows, my shapes go. The thing that I'm focused on now, one, getting my contrasts stronger, getting my darks darker. My lights I'm not going to go any lighter than what I've got, but I can make them look brighter by getting the darks darker. I've got to clean up edges, working on little tiny things. This is what matters to me right now. The other thing is just catching little details, sharpening edges. So contrast is one, building up contrast. The other is cleaning up edges. Those are the two things I'm really focusing on at this point. And here, I don't even need my reference photo as much. I'm still using it, but towards the end, the further along I get, I'm going to start using it less and less and just stepping away from my piece and deciding what would make mine better. Do I think mine would look better if a certain area is lighter or darker? That's what's kind of going through my head at that stage. And I'm using a lot of my darker pencils too. The 6B and the 8B I'm pulling out much, much more at this stage. Since I've already got the lighter ones in, I'm darkening so much up at this point. I feel pretty safe to jump into the darker pencils. And still not pushing very hard. I will start adding a bit more pressure when I'm getting some of the edges really, really clean. I may push a bit harder, but not too much. Remember, if you damage the tooth of the paper, you do limit how many layers you can add on top of it. You're really starting to see here too, that flower that's all the way to the left, that upper left corner, doesn't fit with the rest of these. The size is different. The shape of the petals is different. It's, I guess, further back. I think it was the same kind of flower. It had some other stuff in front of it that I had removed on mine. I didn't, it just really starts distracting or taking away from the rest of the piece, and removing it made such a difference on the composition. So now I'm pulling the background into the center of that flower. See how I'm getting that bumpy edge? Yes, it makes the center a little bit smaller, but it's the texture that I need along that edge. So when I initially blended that, I did leave a little bit of extra space there, knowing I needed to be able to pull some of the background in. You have to watch which direction you pull things, because you will make something larger or smaller. I remember a question from one of our Q&A videos from a while back. Somebody was asking, they were having trouble because every time they were drawing a cat, it was coming out too fat. It was too fluffy. Well, the reason is she was drawing the outside line of the cat and then going back through when she'd add the texture for the edges of the fur, she pulled it out over the background. What would have worked better there is to pull some in from the background and some out from the cat. Go both directions so that you keep it about the edge where she had initially drawn things out, or intentionally draw it in a little bit, knowing some of those edges for the fluff had to be stuck coming out of those outer edges. So just be aware of that when you have a texture like that, where you know you're going to need to either, one, pull, if you're adding highlights, let's say I was using a gel pen, if I was going to pull highlights out into the background, that's going to make the center of that flower larger. I'm going to pull the background into the flower, as I did here, or the center, in order to create that texture. That's going to make that area a little bit smaller. Just keep that in mind when you're deciding how to draw things out. When you have to get a bumpy texture like that, where one area really needs to overlay the other. If you zoom in at any one of these areas of the petal, it won't look like a flower petal at all. So don't, I've seen people get frustrated as they work on something like this because it doesn't look right. It does when it all comes together. Just trust that. And I think you'll gain more confidence in that the more that you paint and draw, the more projects that you complete using that, knowing that it's going to be different. Here you go. You saw where I just erased with the Tombow Mono Eraser. See how I pulled out some highlights. That's as light as I'm going to really get it to go, though, where I'm erasing areas that had the 8B. So it's worth having your eraser out, and the Tombow Mono Eraser works really, really well, but just remember, you're only going to go so light. Now, I could also use that. Let's say I wanted to pull out some more circles to get the bokeh effect. They would stay dark, but you would have that added texture there, so it could be used for that as well. You just have to remember, it's not going to get that light. They would be the darker circles that you would end up being able to create with it. And I've really got to watch now areas that I darken up because so many of these petals are just bleeding into each other. So in order to make one petal stand out more, that means I need to, in this case, I'm going to have to darken most of it since I can't lighten things up much. But I've got to really watch my values here. And this is where I was talking about before, how working in black and white is going to teach you more about values because you're dependent on that, on your values to separate one thing from the next. Now, it'll be tempting to think, well, I'll just outline things. I'll make a dark outline around everything and that will separate it. Not if you want it to look good or look realistic. If you want it to look like a cartoon, go for it. Or really, even if you wanted a more kind of pop art style, then that actually looks really good. So it's not that there's never a time for that to look amazing. But on something like this, I'm not going for that look. So just going through and outlining it, yeah, they look separate, but they don't look realistic if I were to do that. So instead, I've got to focus on my lights and my darks to separate one area from the next. And because I can't go too light, I've got to work more on darkening an area next to a light area to make the light area separate from the area next to it. If I've got too much water on that brush, I'm getting the water, like the pooling of water on there. I'm just going to dab that paintbrush off onto my paper towel. Let it absorb some of the water. See, I'm smudging this into the light area now too, because I don't want the lights to be that light in that area. Just darkening it a little bit based on the graphite that my paintbrush has picked up. Same thing here. I'm just picking up graphite from another area and smudging it into the next area I wanted a bit darker. I could take the HB, and I think that would have been about the right value, so that would have been an option for that area too. Now for this paper, if you've not tried it before and you do want to try it, don't buy it from Amazon. well, I don't know, you might have the price drop occasionally, but when I just checked on Amazon, the prices were pretty, I mean, it's an expensive paper anyway, and if you're getting it in the block, it comes with 20 sheets, but it seemed like it was so much more expensive on Amazon than to buy from Jerry's or Dick Blick. I bought mine from Dick Blick. And I was sitting there when I initially saw the price of the 16 by 20 inch. It was something like $73 for one pad of paper. And I'm thinking that can't be right. But you have to figure it's 20 sheets. So each sheet was $3 and something cents. So when you think of it for the bigger sheet, for a 16 by 20. So when you think of it that way, it's not that expensive because normally I buy them individually and they run about that much anyway. So it's about the same. It's just that you're buying 20 of them at a time. But working in the block, definitely, at least now, I mean, this is my first time working on a watercolor block or finishing a project. I've worked on them before, I just never finished anything, but actually finishing something on these, and I absolutely love it so far. So I do see myself buying some of the bigger ones. It'll be interesting to see how I like it for colored pencil though, because if I do, then that's going to be nice too, to be able to work on a block instead of having to tape my work to a board. So we'll see. If nothing else, I'm pretty sure for Inktense watercolor, I think this will be the paper I switch to, being that the Fabriano seems to be a bit less happy about water media lately, which is hilarious for a watercolor paper. You want to remember when you're using any type of water-soluble pencil, treat it like you would as a watercolor when you're shopping for paper. You're not going to want to use this. Like, I wouldn't try this on Canson Me-Tens. That paper doesn't play as nicely with water. I mean, it works to an extent with odorless mineral spirits and colored pencil. That was fine, but I don't think if I'm going to use this much water, that would be my first choice. So do make sure you're using some kind of paper that is intended for water media. Some kind of watercolor paper is ideal, or even a mixed media paper can, depending on how heavy weight the paper is, might be able to handle it okay. But I wouldn't jump to something like Stonehenge. Would probably not be my first choice because, again, it's not really meant for watercolor or water media. Although I do believe Stonehenge does have some watercolor paper now I haven't tried, so that would probably be okay. But the regular Stonehenge would not be something I would jump into with these. So the type of paper that you choose will make a difference. You can see I'm using the brush to create these sketchy lines that are more subtle than I would get if I went with straight pencil. And I'm just going to continue building, continue working on contrast. And once I turned the camera off, I sat way closer to the work so I could really see, and I did go through and sharpen up my edges even more than what you're going to see on the video. But it's just using the same techniques, going around the edges, making sure things are nice and clean. You know, you don't have to blend every single pencil stroke out with water. If your pencil stroke looked good how it was without water, then that's fine. Don't feel like everything has to have water go on top of it. It just depends on that area, what look you're going for. But some of these final details, I left pencil by itself without blending. Really darkening up some of these intersections. And look how much brighter the white looks next to it, even though it's not actually white, but it will look brighter by darkening up what's next to it. And even if you're working in color, that's often a problem people have. They feel like they can't get their brights bright enough. It's not usually that the bright isn't bright enough, or they'll want a brighter white. Like, what tube of paint is the brightest white? That's probably not your problem, because you probably don't really want things to be straight white anyway, and in very few cases would you want them white. The problem is that you're not getting your darks dark enough. That's really where you want to shift your focus to. If you find yourself in a position where you're painting or drawing, your lights just are never light enough, it's because your darks probably aren't dark enough. Unless you're just super messy and you accidentally blended over everything and made them too dark too soon. That can happen. But more often than not, the situation is not getting the darks dark enough. And that is scary. It is scary to get your darks darker because you feel like, oh, it's going to be too much. Usually it's not. Normally it's the opposite problem. So now I've got that pencil really sharp. See there, that edge, I cleaned it up, but I'm pulling the area that I darkened up where I cleaned it, I'm pulling it out into the background, not into the flower petal, because that would create, I'd still have an edge that was softer than what I wanted there. If I want it crisp, I want to darken that background and pull it away from the petal when I blend out with the water. And this is honestly one of the most enjoyable mediums that I work in, which is funny because I don't do it that often. But every time I pick it up, I find myself just with this stupid grin on my face. They're so much fun to work on. Part, I think, is that instant gratification. You move through your project much faster than with any other medium. Because your black and white is going to be faster anyway, and then black and white that's water soluble, you get a lot done very, very quickly. They definitely are a fun medium, one that I really do recommend trying. Luckily, they're fairly inexpensive. Last time I checked on Amazon, they were under $10. If you get them from like Michael's or Hobby Lobby and use a 40% coupon, you're probably going to spend around $15 for the full set. And I wouldn't run out and buy a bunch of very expensive paintbrushes either. The ones that I'm using here, other than the Simply Simmons, are all just generic. And even Simply Simmons is fairly inexpensive. So cheap brushes actually do work, but I like the Taklon bristle the best. And if you've got any of the water pencils or water brushes that carry the water on the back end, I have a lot from Derwent, those work too. And the white of the paper appears to be in the video a little bit brighter, a crisper white than I think it really looks like in person. It actually is going to be closer at this stage to what you're seeing on that finished photo. Of course, monitor variation and all of that, but at least from what I'm seeing, it looks more accurate to the finished photo than what the video is capturing. The video, the light that I use, as much as I love it for painting, in video it tends to wash things out of it. So this is more accurate depending on the light that you have it in, because certain light, if you've got it in super strong light with the graphite, it picks up and it makes it a little bit more gray, a lot lighter on some of the darkest areas. In just the normal lighting that I would have it displayed in if it was hanging on my wall, this is the most accurate. So that's what, when I do my video editing, I try to make it as close to what people would see as possible. But that is it for this one. If you have tried the water soluble graphite, I would love to hear what you thought about them. I just think they're so much fun.